Okay, so what I wanted to talk about with empathy was actually the complexities of empathy, because I think it's gotten a lot of positive press over the last 10 years. And then I think over the last maybe 3 or 4 years, there were a couple of different books that came out that were about the dark side of empathy. And I think originally I said the dark side of empathy, but then I remembered I actually don't believe in the dark side of empathy. What I actually believe in is that empathy is complex and that empathy has complexities to it that we should be aware of because it helps us manage it. And I thought of this in relation to the Roblox module in particular, because there's just so much about it that is about interacting with other people. And therefore, it just felt like it was quite topical. And so there's so many ways to approach empathy, but I like to think about it in terms of that there's three different types of empathy. So the first for me is cognitive empathy. This is when we know how the other person feels and what they might be thinking, or we think we know how the other person feels and what they might be thinking. And by putting ourselves in their shoes, we can think like they think, right? The second one, quite similar, is a little bit more emotional. Some people call this affective empathy. But the description of that one is when you more physically feel the emotions of the other person. And the third is compassionate empathy. Not everybody, a lot of people will always say the first two, but not everyone has this third one. I have some teachers that have added this topic in, compassionate empathy. So I like to think about this as a third one, which is you can both understand and feel the person's situation, but you also have some type of compulsion, some type of motivation to actually help the situation. So now I want to talk about the complexities of each of these three. And the first is that in cognitive empathy, the dark triad, which are the Machiavellians, the sociopaths, and the narcissists. So the dark triad, they don't actually have the ability to be empathic, right? It's not something that they actually possess. However, they actually have the ability to use this skill, right? They can very often know how other people might feel in a situation and therefore use it against them, right? To be really dark, torture would be the extreme example of this, right? Or anyone that's psychological torture, not just physical torture, but to really understand what will really trouble or hostage taking, right? Anytime where you use it for bad by knowing how you're going to make the other person feel. So that's something to watch out for, but not in yourself, of course, but for others. The one thing, though, that I also think of when I think about this topic is what's called vaporistic empathy, which my favorite example of that is helicopter parenting, because it's the living vicariously, right? So as a parent, it's always about saying, yeah, my son wants this, my daughter likes that, and would love this, right? Would love to go here, would love to have that, be successful at this. And so that's so much of what turns into helicopter parenting is this type of miscue on the complexity of empathy and thinking that you know more about what the other person wants and feels than you really do. So on emotional empathy, the complexities or risks, if you will, are one, psychological exhaustion, right? I was reading, or I saw a video the other day with Glennon Doyle, and she was talking about how when she watches this one television show, I don't actually know the television show, but it's about a survivor where they're out in the woods, and how she was like sickly. She was covered in a blanket, freezing cold, and felt so awful. And her wife came in and said, "What is wrong with you?" And she was experiencing like psychological exhaustion. She takes emotional empathy to such an extreme. She knows this is an issue, but just listening to her tell about this, right? I remember times where when I was when I was in college, I was helping out at the local hospital. I was on the hospital administrator track as part of my degree. And I had this real issue in the fact that I couldn't talk to patients. One of my things to do is just talk to patients and see how, they were feeling after their admissions process. And for ones that had gone through real trauma, I found it quite difficult. I would start to physically experience, I would start to get, like speckly and almost faint. As a matter of fact, I fainted twice. So this is extreme. And some people have it really badly where they actually can physically feel what the other person's feeling. But psychological exhaustion can happen to anyone, where you just start to become so close to that person and what they're going through that you start experiencing it. And frankly, you don't really do them any good, and you don't do yourself any good. So it's something to watch for sure. Because there's no plus side. You're not doing the other person a disservice to protect yourself from that. The other two complexities around emotional empathy that I find interesting are group polarization, which is, if you think about Thanksgiving, Christmas family gathering, and two people will start going head to head on a particular topic. If you can see one person is getting or both of them are getting quite passionate about their topic, and you align with one or the other, what happens is that people will start to divide, right? And all of a sudden, a topic that wasn't really yours, a fight that wasn't yours, you can actually start feeling what that person is feel their outrage, feel their anger, and you can create polarization, as opposed to, sometimes it's better to just be able to be the neutral person, remaining neutral, hearing what both sides have to offer. We could see this in an extreme in political environments now, right? Where we've just, in so many, not just in America, but in so many countries, where we're ending up with real polarization on particular topics. And people start to become outraged about this group or that group that they're not actually even part of. So it can be used for good, for sure, but it's just something to watch out for in terms of unintended group polarization. The other thing that goes closely with that is projected intentions, where very often, if we see someone feeling a certain way, if we project the intentions onto them, so we start saying, that's because of this, right? That's because of how they were treated as a child, or that's because you fill in the blank however you want, then we're projecting intentions onto the person to explain how they're feeling, and we start to internalize it. And that's not healthy for them either, right? We think we're doing them a service by trying to justify and explain why they're feeling a certain way. But just letting them feel it, and just letting them be, and letting them explain how and why they may feel a certain thing, is much healthier than trying to project onto them. The trick with this, particularly about psychological exhaustion, is that, and I learned this in courses I've done specifically about empathy, which is the trick with empathy. When we tell people, be empathic, you can't internalize it. You have to actually stop short of bringing it in, right? You have to be able to appreciate, understand, but create those boundaries and hold that space for that person without jumping into that space with them. What I'm not saying to do is to create walls and detachment. And this is one of the areas of stress for those in the medical profession, where they have to create walls, right, to protect themselves. And that's one of the reasons why there's so much psychological burnout in that field. But that's a completely different topic, and that's not your professional group. But it's a good lesson learned for us as career people to make sure that we are always watching for that wall and saying, okay, we're not trying to create a wall where we can't feel anything. It's all about creating that space and being observant of it, but not jumping into it ourselves. And then lastly, the complexity about compassionate empathy is that when we say we want to feel moved to help, we have to be careful that it's if needed. Right? And this, again, there's a quite cultural thing here in the United States. I find people are very helpful. As a matter of fact, I remember when I first moved abroad, that I observed how little people helped each other on the tube in London. Whereas in the US, I mean, if you start reading the subway map in New York, like 5 people will start telling you, what are you looking? Where are you trying to go? What stop are you trying to get off at? And I remember when I first moved back to the US after years away, I started like checking my pockets to make sure that someone wasn't trying to pickpocket me. I thought it was a ruse to distract my attention in order to steal my iPhone or steal my bag or something. And so I had forgotten that it is really cultural. It's a very big culture here in the US, is to always be helping. I also have one of my closest friends is English, and she'll often, I'll vent about something, and then she'll say, are you venting or do you want my opinion, right? And I'll say, your opinion, always your opinion. But the reverse is not true, right? In English culture, she's not always looking for me to give her opinion. So I've had to learn to remember to say to her, do you want my opinion on this? Just yes, please. Because again, it's quite cultural actually. And so I hadn't realized that until I started working in international firms and dealing with people from different cultures, that different people are different with respect to that. So it's something to be aware of, both culturally, but just in general with people, is not only if they need it, but also be able to self-filter on your own ability to help and prioritize, right? So very often I'll find myself like trying to help someone on something, and then I realize, you know what, I'm not actually an expert on that, right? I only know like one bit of information. And so I have to decide, like, is my one bit of information actually helpful, or should I let someone else who's more qualified really step in? So there are limits to how help, and again, it's purely about protecting yourself too from emotional exhaustion, and also just weighing too much on the other person. I noticed yesterday on one of our community sites, someone was saying, oh, I need a new hair colorist out where I live. Does anyone have a recommendation? There were like 51 responses, and all with like 20 different suggestions. And I thought, well, she needed to be more specific, right? She needed to be able to say, I'm looking for a colorist who meets this profile. Does anyone have that? Right? Because every single woman in this community has a colorist that well, most of us have colorists that they love. And so they were going to recommend. But how on earth, now all she has is 30 names to have to go Google or figure out or see who had the most votes. And so I thought, when the other side of it is true too, when you're actually looking for help and you want people to be there for you, you need to be specific enough as to exactly what it is you're asking. And the caution to watch out for in terms of compassionate empathy is what some people call the hero mentality. There's a lot of interesting debate, frankly, about compassionate empathy in terms of, is it really for the other person or is it really for us? I actually think it's a useless debate, because of course it's for us. We feel good when we help other people. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, right? Because if we're still helping, who really cares if it makes us feel good and it helps them? The over the edge thing to watch out for is hero mentality, which becomes where you just, this is an extreme, right? Where you just believe that you can help everyone all the time, and it just elevates yourself in terms of your view, right? That you're rescuing someone. And so that's the dark side of compassionate empathy, is when it goes to that extreme. That's such a small fraction of people, but it's something to watch out for in others.